Donc, on y va. Michel, il y a encore du monde là. Pouvez-vous vous installer, s'il vous plaît? Ok. On y va? On y va. Samar Younes is a Beirut-born, Brooklyn-based quantum craft artist-theorist and founder of SAMARITUAL, actively mutating craft into a reality-composing insurgent technology, transforming organizations through cultural archaeology and strategic insurgency. Previously, Younes studied architecture and visual communication and holds degrees in scenography from Central St. Martin's. With 25 plus years as artistic director at the intersection of art, commerce, and culture, her Future Ancestors series and Imaginology Quantum Crafts Lab guide practitioners in developing kaleidoscopic intelligence as essential future literacy. International Speaking Circuit, CSM, Parsons, NYU, Dubai Future Foundation, Doha Debates, featured in Wired, GQ, WGSN, Frame, and more. Mentor at the New Museum of Contemporary Art Incubator, New Inc., recently published at AI Art Magazine's Critical Intelligence issue and Compass APF Futures of Creativity issue. She publishes Quantum Culture Substack, exploring post-disciplinary approaches to cultural production that challenges binary categorization and monoculture. Pour un petit teaser, Quantum Craft, la présentation en question, operates through superposed epistemologies where artisanal, ancestral, ecological, and artificial intelligences refuse synthesis. This talk excavates how craft, when practiced, becomes reality-composing technology when practiced through transcultural navigation, treating imperfection and mutation as intentional insurgent methodology rather than accident against monoculture. Samar.
Hi everyone. I'm going to speak in English if that's okay with you, because it's more comfortable for me than speaking in French, despite my French education initially. Thank you so much, Samit, for the introduction and for your incredible presentation performance. That was really beautiful and intense. And I also want to thank Janine and Michelle as well for inviting me to share this with you, because whenever there is an opportunity and I'm in town, there is nothing that gives me more pleasure than sharing a lot of what I'm working on, which is very much in future communities and transcendental sort of practices with people in Lebanon, and specifically students here in Alba and beyond, so they can sort of learn from a lot of what we're like navigating and building towards when we're talking about futures and future literacy. So today we're going to talk about quantum craft, as Samit mentioned, and I'm going to elaborate on what that is, but it's important to note that to me, how I sort of qualified it or quantified it, the idea of quantum and craft that usually don't coexist together. When I talk about quantum, it's not about the scientific idea of what quantum is or the science of quantum technology. I'm talking about quantum through a sort of philosophical lens, meaning superposition and sort of multiple things happening simultaneously all at once. And when I talk about craft, I talk very much about the act of craftsmanship and artisanship. So how do those two things coexist, and how can we kind of craft the intangible? And that's what we're going to sort of discuss. Let me make sure this works. Okay. We're going to talk about kaleidoscope, not centaurs. Oftentimes, our ideas of the future is quite dystopian, as Samar just presented, or, you know, when we visualize the future or aesthetic of the futures, it's oftentimes in this very much machine versus man binary. What I sort of speak about, and what I kind of propose, is looking at us more like kaleidoscope that refracts, very prismatic, and think of our being in the future beyond just this binary paradigm of machine versus human. And the reason being is because oftentimes the centaur discourse that is predominant in futures, and especially now with the sort of proliferation of generative AI and soon to be quantum technology, is very much based on hierarchy, binary choices, and this fantasy of mastery, which is a very patriarchal epistemology, let's face it, right? But when we talk about kaleidoscope, it's something that is sort of much more fluid. It refuses synthesis. It is something that holds multiple systems at once in productive tension. So it is, when we talk about like the not knowing area in between, is where the most interesting things could manifest. So how can we maintain complexity rather than resolving it, is what this proposes as a metaphor, which is very much more of a feminist epistemology. What if the most sophisticated methodology for holding multiple knowledge systems simultaneously weren't invented in research lab, but have been practiced for millennia? Sufi mystics perfecting epistemological multiplicity through embodied ritual, Phoenician ancestor navigating cultural crossroad as survival technology, Levantine matriarch orchestrating household, land system, educational transmission, and intergenerational memory across empire. Kaleidoscopic intelligence as ancestral inheritance, not contemporary innovation. And this is very important because when I talk about knowledge multiplicity, is about thinking of ourselves beyond just the now. As a futurist and working a lot in futures, we always think of ourselves and imagine ourselves in any present situation that we have. Imagine always in any problem you try to solve that there is 1,000 ancestors, or millions of course, but you can sort of make it a bit more tight if you want to sort of imagine who those might be. 1,000 ancestors behind you, plenty more thousands are near you, and then 1,000 more ahead of you. So how do you sort of think or resolve or kind of propose any ideas that you might be developing with this in mind? What has your particular lived experience taught you to hold in disciplinary hypothesis? What institution demand you categorize, label, box, or flatten? And you're going to see me talk a lot about this and talk a lot about what disciplinary hypothesis is. And I think Samar touched upon it a little bit in his presentation when he invoked one of the scholar that was talking this productive tension between disciplines, the place of not knowing, and not necessarily working within disciplines, but sort of moving between them and sort of documenting the process and sort of testing and playing to see what might happen. And the reason why I say your lived experience is very important in your cartography, because every person has a very unique, like a thumbprint cartography that informs what their kaleidoscopic intelligence is. And we're not all equal because of that particular lived experience that's not necessarily taught in an institution. Institutions, just like the algorithm, oftentimes demand that you are put in labels and boxes and in very clear categories. And what happens when that occurs, it's flattening. Inadvertently, obviously not always intentional, even in schools, but it does flatten you very much so. So I want to show you this next slide, which is pretty dense on purpose. And the reason why it's dense is because to demonstrate the idea of this lived complexity that we all have very uniquely. And mine, just like any of yours, has layers. Obviously, based on your age, your layers might be a little bit less, but you nevertheless have many layers that oftentimes in the current day and age and with a lot of digital system and technology is always flattened. Same with institution. So how can you sort of face the choice when you look into your cartography, or really take the time to make your cartography a process, and as important as part of your process and how you see the world and how you decipher the world. I'm not going to go through my entire cartography, but you can read some of it on the sort of screen. But what's important to understand is every touch point, you can look at it as a data point, but for me, it was an embodied data point, meaning it's something that's a lived experience that you, if you were to look at it from a human perspective, you're going to relate to it much better than with a machine scanning it and sort of looking into the word and sort of sorting it accordingly. So that sort of gives you a little bit of an insight in terms of how our lived experience versus how the machine categorizes knowledge and how it sort of, with surveillance and such, looks at things in a very different way. And you're going to see through my aesthetic and a lot of my work why my cartography is so specific and important, and how it had informed my later substantial work that you see presented. So I want to also talk about, through my cartography, the evolved system or the evolved kind of archaeology that unfolded through my kind of work life. And initially, I started with craft, and that was a lot of my years creating and crafting artistic intervention in retail spaces. So it was a lot about kind of material experimentation and material mutation. How can you transform ordinary material in an extraordinary way? How can you understand the psychology of the guest or the consumer or the person that's visiting a retail space, and making sure that not only they're experiencing the space that is around them, but also lingering longer and have a bigger sensorial kind of immersive experience within spaces. So craft was a very important part of my, first 10 years career. And eventually that craft mutates it into systems. Although, in the craft here, the narrative foresight campaign were already existing, because you had to write a very evocative story, very much like scenography, and with my scenography background, in order to tell campaign stories in a much more sensorial way. The second sort of stage of my career was where the system development happened, which is between like around 2012, 2021. And that one was informed by the sheer volume of work that I was working on that required systemization. When I was, a global director and a lot of for a lot of different brands, I was dealing with a volume of 600 plus environment to sort of design for. And there were also at once cultural labs. So those environments, not only, let's say store designs were important or pop-ups were important, but they were operating across the globe, different culture, different epistemologies. So understanding how you sort of serve different community and connect with different community in a sort of cultural way, but also through environments was very important, but also scaling these environments for different situations. So how can you sort of, from a modular way, make something that works, that you design, you know, on the computer and prototype, you know, in New York, work, you know, in Japan just as much as it would work, you know, in Mumbai, etc. And how does that culture nuance happen? And this is where I sort of started to sort of look into retail as cultural labs, to how can we kind of create this culture complexity without giving them these very modular kind of cut and paste monoculture unit that it's a New York brand, I'm just gonna like export it just as a New York brand, without the synthesis of what the local community is about and how their culture can show up in these spaces. This also allows me to kind of also have a lot of pattern recognition across domains. You know, when you work in retail and given that my background was scenography, the sort of things that you consider are not only spaces, you know, lighting, environments, object, visual merchandising, storytelling. Think of like spatial advertising and narrative environment. It's not only like that, it's also a lot of psychology, culture, politics. All of this is very much connected, because you got to understand culture as a currency, because that's how you really connect emotively with people. And if you don't understand that and understand the nuance of it, it's very difficult to sort of propose this. How quantum craft emerges, because a lot of my work had to be oftentimes designed or sort of at least strategized 2-3 years ahead. It always required a lot of research across all these domains, and really like interpersonal connection with the different communities as well, to understand really strongly what's going to emerge as the most important trend to sort of kind of be given or proposed as design, but also how can we connect that deeper in a kaleidoscopic way. Then comes sort of the meta system, and the meta system was around a little bit before 2021, and it was right before the pandemic actually, when the pandemic forced us to do everything remotely and digitally, and that was already happening in a lot of ways through the introduction of the metaverse and, you know, the Web3 paradigm, which was basically moving the internet from Web2 to Web3, that becomes more immersive. So how do the environment that I was creating very physically translate into these Web3 environment? How do we create environments in the metaverse that feel as resonant and as sensorial? And I use a lot of the concept of neuroaesthetics, which is basically how your neurology informs or connects to spaces, and how can that subsequently go into spaces that are digital, like metaverse or spaces, to resonate. In order to do that, it was sort of a lot of trial and error, you know, and it was my biggest sort of concern that kept coming up was the aesthetic of the digital spaces was not the aesthetic that I was really informed by and also desired. My training has always been very much in artisanal and material and raw material, and a lot of that aesthetic didn't really translate well with existing systems that are dimensional 3D system or 3D rendering or dimensional rendering. And if you were to translate those material, it would take tons and tons of time and tons of hours. So in 2021, I started experimenting with diffusion models, like AI diffusion models, and then later on, models like Midjourney. It was when it first launched. And in parallel, I was also experiencing when the LLM language-based model, like, you know, ChatGPT, Anthropic, and the like also emerged at the same time. And what I tried to do is try to understand how these tools have taken all the knowledge, because I was looking at it as material. How did it sort of, you know, tag all the material and put it in the system, and not only as documentation, but as a generative process, because AI has existed forever, but not through a generative process, versus these new systems propose a generative process, meaning you can create with them. So how can I create better material-digital entanglement with these systems? Because I could do it at a much higher speed. And that's when I sort of started my research, investigating around 80,000 images that I generated as sort of a research of this material-digital entanglement, but also understanding the bias in these machines and the archetype that are in the machine, and how can you kind of use them simultaneously against culture erasure by hacking the system, but also how can you sculpt with the data like you were an artisan or like you would sculpt clay. All systematic problems that exist in society also exist in the algorithm, is what obviously was very evident in my research. It's just harder to see it when they're embedded in data and code. So it's not like the systems suddenly are biased and stereotypical. It's just very much a reflection of how society has been all along. You know, the systematic bias lives throughout everything that we do. We just choose not to acknowledge it or look past it, but also we chose to feed the machine more of that bias, but it's because it's now completely encoded in the data. And how we did that, and a lot of what I sort of like came across. What I found is Western epistemology is the default knowledge system in a lot of those systems. Because you have to use linguistic and you have to use image, it doesn't sort of pull or understand as deeply all the different types of knowledge systems. There is definitely a significant gender, racial bias, eugenic adjacency in training data. And I'm going to talk to you more about this and what that means. The colonial knowledge hierarchy are reproduced. So the same kind of problematic hierarchy that colonial sort of system have created, you can see them directly reflected in these systems. The culture complexity that we are always striving for, or I'm hoping we're striving for, is enticing, but it's flattened through the linguistic and through the images as well. The indigenous knowledge is non-existent in most of those systems. It's either erased or out of context or appropriated. Because if you take things out of context, oftentimes when it comes to indigenous knowledge, it can be very much diluted. And of course, the global-sized archetypes are very much in stereotype, like very Orientalist tropes, perpetuating this idea that we're often fighting against, and we have been fighting against for years to sort of, against that sort of ideas. Towards tokenization, and it's not the systems only to blame, and it's not only obviously the people that are in power that are developing these systems, these highly capitalistic systems. But it started with social media that taught us to speak in machine syntax. Hashtag, keywords, metrics, fragments of thought turned into searchable coordinates. We optimize our emotion for discoverability, training our inner poets to think like indexing system. That's how we became also tokens, in code, in culture, and representation. All proof of how deeply we've been machinified. In every sort of talk that I've been to, and in the past, couple of months, it's been across 4 different countries, and every time the same question comes along. Aren't you worried that AI is going to take your job? Aren't you worried that AI is going to become more like machines, more like humans? And to me, I'm more sort of concerned that we are voluntarily becoming more like machines because of our conditioning and our extreme domestication towards wanting to sort of be seen and be amplified. We sort of completely succumb to how the algorithm wants us to show up, specifically in digital spaces. We don't necessarily show up authentically. Even in spaces, we are optimizing for the gram oftentimes. When you go visit a place, you're not really paying attention oftentimes to, let's say, an exhibit or an artifact or, a space that you encounter because you're too busy taking a picture of it or taking sort of a picture of you with it, so you can then post it and kind of feed it to the machine to get better metrics and to get better positioning. So what ends up happening, a lot of our embodied experiences become very much syntaxes. And this is how the machine works. If you understand deeply how the LLM models are, and the reason why I call them very much patriarchal system, because patriarchal system can be great at bullshitting, no offense to the patriarchy over here. And the reason being is they can appear very logical, they can deliver something really well, so you can ask an LLM anything, and it can give you something that feels like very deep, very philosophical, very logical, but in reality, you know, oftentimes it's delivering it with such confidence that you don't detect the bullshit. And it's a great bullshitter because it is so confident. So we have these amazingly confident machines that are, you know, are basically syntaxing different words together in a mathematical equation in order to produce knowledge and system that we are then recycling and regenerating off over and over. So what I want to sort of propose and look into next is how do we come from hashtag, the conditioning from hashtag into hybrid minds? How do we undomesticate ourselves in this extreme sort of act of domestication that is leading to digital colonization with AI and quantum computing and eventually as a cherry on top? We have been conditioned to think in systems built for optimization, whether it's capitalistic, patriarchal, and data-driven logic that reward legibility over complexity. The hashtag turned culture into code, metrics into meaning, turned meaning into math. These same systems mirror the hierarchies they were built from: capitalistic, patriarchal, colonial. But cracks are forming, and through them, new way of thinking emerge. And this is basically a lot of the method in how I operate. You know, I've operated in institution for a long time and in corporate, but every system has cracks in education, business, and technology. These aren't failures. They're portals where healing-centered futures can emerge. The question isn't whether to break them down or patch them up. It's how to grow transcultural wisdom through the spaces they didn't think to control. And there are many spaces and many ways you can still, you know, work towards this transcultural wisdom, but also synthesizing and thinking through this kaleidoscopic way by not kind of going with the status quo of these dominant kind of shifts, and how you work undercover and in a very insurgent way. And that's where quantum craft and how quantum craft was born, which is a type of resistance and a systematic refusal to become, becoming systematic resistance infrastructure. How can we refuse algorithmic domestication? How can we refuse being flattened into single categories? How can we refuse institutional demand for legibility? And a way to maintain culture complexity when every system demands reduction. And this is very much a research-based, tested, and cultivated skill. It's not unique to me per se, it is unique to all of you, and it's very achievable. It's understanding how to tap into it and how to activate it. How can we sort of utilize observation, play, and sensing as a critical part of how we operate and how we think? Things that sort of the machine are very sort of impossible to replicate. And how can we play along these multiple cultural frequencies? And this is what, you know, it's going to lead me to the upcoming sort of part in which is developing what I call articulatory intelligence. You know, when you say somebody's articulate, meaning they can sort of communicate something really well, articulatory intelligence is not how you communicate things, but how you actually are able to work with these systems in a way that outsmarts them and hacks them to be the counter force of what they tend to do. This is from a project called Creaturekin that you see on the screen. And there are these entities that I had created as detection entity, or these playful kind of creature kins, and they were supposed to help somebody in their cancer journey, being a breast cancer survivor, for example. How can you sort of make the act of detection more playful? How can you create a digital physical artifact that not only kind of connect you to ways of looking at yourself or detecting or playfully doing something that could be quite stressful, but then how can they kind of also have purpose and create a further amplification of your senses and your sensory perspectives? How quantum craft sort of like pulls from, and the different intelligence stream it pulls from, and that's why it sort of is quintessentially hybrid. It is also based very much on your unique cartography. So in my quantum craft, the intelligence stream that I pull from is ancestral intelligence, artisanal intelligence, and ecological intelligence. These particular category came from the cartography of mine that you saw earlier. Obviously, all of it are being tapped into through the sensing foundation as a source, which is the embodied intelligence. And let's sort of talk briefly about what these intelligence systems are and how they came about. First is ecological intelligence, which to me is like the mycelium healing network as the underground resistance. So how did your experience teach you to recognize pattern across time scale is ecological intelligence? What natural system has your life required you to understand is ecological intelligence. So you could see a lot of the images here are also images from, nature captured in Beirut, because to me it's so inspiring to see nature as a form of insurgency and rebellion. It is neglected by the government, it's not maintained, but it performed in a very sort of poetic way, a rebellious act, by still refusing to sort of be flattened and growing in places that are very impromptu, whether it is on, electrical cable or whatever it is. It's refusing to be anything but nature and beautiful and mycelium. And this is basically how we can learn a lot from how can we kind of circumvent and go beyond, the system that are meant to control us and put us in this box through this observation method and deification method. The second intelligence is ancestral intelligence, and I sort of talk about it as culture memory as a Trojan horse. The reason why culture memory is so important to me is because, and I always look for it so deeply, is because again, with my experience, a lot of my memory is fuzzy. It could be maybe from chemo, it could be from menopause, it could be from whatever, but I always thrive very deeply to sort of look into, in any occasion I can, through these oral history and storytelling method in order to cultivate and keep ancestral knowledge flowing. Whenever there is an opportunity, speaking to the elders about this is so important. So to me, thinking of what culture memory do you carry specifically? What are the survival strategy that your ancestors passed down to you explicitly and implicitly? And they can be culture pattern, it could be very much street knowledge, all the different type of intelligence that we deemed not worthy of academic knowledge because it's not logical, it's not, brain specific. So how, at least logic specific. So how do these memory system predating computation help us? And how does the street knowledge as survival strategy, or war knowledge, of course, as survival strategy as well? And last but not least is the artisanal intelligence. So this is the knowledge that's the embodied sensing, and it is a stealth technology. When you're working with your hand, it's very slow. So for me, it's like, how can I use the same slowness to sculpt with data how I'm sculpting, let's say, with clay? So it's the knowledge that's lived in the fingertip that the machine cannot capture. It's a sensory wisdom, taste, touch, smell, sound. It's that neuroaesthetic intelligence, which is beauty as cognitive technology. The somatic wisdom, the body as primary research instrument. When you move through your body, when you sing, when you do all these things. And the culture-making practices. So where does your embodied knowledge live, which is very specific to you, and what has your body learned that institutions typically dismiss as subjective. The hybrid intelligence stream orchestration and how basically quantum craft cultivates what I call articulate intelligence, and the word cultivate here is key, because it's not like a formula A plus B, it's how you cultivate this by paying attention and cultivating those two things, logic and practice. The logic in this part is obviously the critical, methodological, and intuitive, have contextual code switching, which is a very feminist way of being. When I say code switching, meaning, for instance, a woman can very fluidly move from the boardroom to taking care of the kids to the kitchen. Men do as well, but not as fluidly and such a easy way to sort of move between contexts and adapt accordingly. Operating through the cracks and also sensory calibration. And how that is in the logic way is by keeping radical imagination alive, cultivating what I call ethno-aesthetic acumen. So my cartography is well cultivated by ethno-aesthetic acumen. Just like the machines are trained on certain aesthetics, your particular experience, you develop your point of view is by having all these things that you have observed throughout your life and being, that you were drawn to and worked with, that impacted you and developed your aesthetic. And of course, the epistemological multiplicity. And then in practice, being an active insurgent, so actively hacking these systems, not using them how they taught you to use them, and not learning from the engineer that are programming them, but learn from the artisan in order to hack the machine like the artisan does. Pattern seeding as well, and there's a typo here, and layering and accumulation. So I talk a lot about what I call Silk Road multiplicity. So when knowledge flowed during the Silk Road era, it flowed in a very reciprocal way. And you always knew what the provenance is. So let's say the cedar, we knew the cedar always originated from Lebanon, and it sort of took on different shapes when it sort of moved in different cultures and different construction method. But we don't have the same idea of provenance in colonial kind of system, because most of the colonial era takes something, erases it, and then claims it as its own. So when we think about practice, how can we always think of provenance when we're working with these machines and sort of understand deeply this reciprocity paradigm? How can we kind of be more transcultural, and how can we rewild versus intervene? So creating more mutation opportunities. And this is basically how this hybrid intelligence can occur if you were to utilize AI through articulate intelligence. How I view artificial intelligence, I view it as a biased, multidisciplinary aggregator material, meaning it is a material system that's aggregated. Think of it as a collective knowledge system that's really well archived through these tokenized method that's very mathematical. So in order for you to work with it in an articulatory way, like I described in the previous slide, you have to sort of hack it to become a pattern recognition synthesizer, to reweave linguistic, to create more of a concentrated cultural memory with it. For it to become a super amplifier and instrument as a compass for you, you have to sort of seed it the right data accordingly. You got to craft the data as material. You got to think about it through multi-temporality. This is the first time in history we can actually use different time scales as medium, which have not been possible as easily in the past. We can have it as a cross-genre pollinator. It can be almost like the infrastructure for Silk Road 2.0. It can be a serendipity engine and an imagination cultivator, and allow you to do that well later in age and intergenerational because it doesn't have a limitation. It also helps infinite iteration and mutation, just like nature, how it sort of propagate and mycelium. It allows you to have multiple generations of one particular root, whether it's language or image, and being able to mutate from it like a mycelium. And of course, it's a collective intelligence weaver as well. This all is possible through articulate intelligence on these systems. So I want to sort of look into how can we operate across time, culture, and technology, and do so with multiple systems and hybridity. How can your full culturography inform this? I'm going to show you that in practice with my particular business model, as to speak, and why it's post-disciplinary. I work across 3 different rituals that operate simultaneously in what I call a feminist post-disciplinary praxis. And the reason being is because in the cultivator sort of ritual is where I do a lot of my work around education and research. And the creator practice is where I do a lot of creation. And in the catalyst practice is where I do a lot of intervention. This is basically what I call kaleidoscopic intelligence, in terms of not only looking at the outcome of your work as the end product, but looking into your entire process. These are not separate businesses to me. They're feedback loops. Like making artifacts shows me what organization usually need. Hacking organization shows me what I need to teach. And teaching shows me what artifacts I need to make next. So they kind of feed each other and they inform each other, and the process of making it is just as important. Just like as the process of creating more complexity is just as important. This creates the idea of complexity, and that's what allows me to operate across different disciplines as well. In the sort of catalyst discipline, that's where I have my mutation strategy lab. That's where I work with a lot of like brand and system to create pattern recognition and foresight reports. That's where I sort of use epistemological hacking as a feminist methodology and transcultural navigation. So I can be speaking at a conference for high-end jewelry, on contemporary art or architecture simultaneously, just because I'm talking about the method rather than the end product. In my cultivator ritual, that's where I'm seeding radical imagination and playful learning. That's where I'm amplifying this feminist pedagogical infrastructure, and that's where I'm also amplifying hybrid creativity and critical thinking. And those workshops are very hybrid. They can be digital and they can be physical. They are also how you intervene on a lot of these AI systems, but they're also how you imagine yourself as a future ancestor through a lot of physical artifacts. And you know, I've taught 3,000 innovators and creative from 12 countries, 23 organizations that are very, very broad and very different, because it's more about the methodology of thinking and cultivating whether it's your cartography, your ethno-aesthetic acumen, how you're looking at pattern, not as a machine, how it does a pattern recognition, but through a very human knowledge-based system. And I do so also as the incubator at New Inc., which is basically the first museum incubator at the intersection of art, culture, and technology in New York. Next is my creator ritual, and that's where I create a lot of artifacts that are very hybrid. They're future ancestral artifacts, and they live either physical or digital form, and they're very cross-genre intervention. So you could see the one once the machine, for instance, was a purely digital exhibit and a sort of on a metaversal platform. The one next to it was a hybrid exhibit that was these textile sculpture with images. And the third one was something that is purely sort of like digital animated, but is developing now later on into physical form with like a jewelry sort of partner, for example. Next is, I wanted to talk to you about this particular example. These were scholars that I worked with. They're all incredible, amazing scholars that are working to do very important work. They're educators, and they are basically trying to create educational systems that are more healing-based futures. How can you make education that's healing-based, and each in their own way? But they commissioned me to create portrait for them through my future ancestor demonstration. And I did it through this archaeological layers, through this material intelligence. I wanted to make sure that you have the ancestral, so I was excavating, you know, their heritage, whether it's the Dominican or Puerto Rican or Caribbean. All of those were taken into consideration. I was taking into consideration the matriarchal knowledge transmission based on their heritage. I took into consideration the ecological intelligence, which is the botanical intelligence that a lot of Caribbean ecosystem carry. So a lot of the symbolism, the things that you see, were all prototyped, they were all initially done by hand, woven and created, and then mutated through AI system like mycelium network. Just like in the artisanal also, the craft tradition, the textile logic, and the ornamental complexity as resistant was also kind of utilizing each portrait, taking hours to really bring it to life, how it honors them, and it also honors the healing work. Like the first image was Angel Acosta, who is a doctor and somebody who is an incredible in his community as an impact, and a great healer and educator. So utilizing, for instance, bronze thread and bronze filament, known for its property and how it's woven, and giving homage to the plantation, the tobacco plantation where he's from, was also part of the design of his portrait. Just to wrap it up, I have a couple of things I want to sort of leave you with before we do a brief kind of embodied exercise together for a minute. I want to think about quantum craft as a mycelium and kaleidoscopic entanglement, and not just a theoretical framework. Its operational system is for maintaining cultural complexity when every institution typically have demanded flattening. How can new technologies serve as translators between different knowledge systems rather than homogenizing them? Like mycelium network that connect entire forest underground, hybrid intelligence system reveal the hidden connective tissue between seemingly disparate culture expression. What hidden conversation might already be unfolding between desert survival strategies and neural network? This is the space in which I'm interested in connecting. How might ancestral knowledge system and conversational model be whispering to each other beneath the surface of our awareness? So what are you holding? If you can close your eyes for 60 minutes. I'm just gonna make sure I could see you, that you're doing so. And if you can think about what you're holding simultaneously right now, whatever comes to mind, that you have been taught typically to separate or to sort of like numb or to sort of have not part of you. So I'm gonna start the clock now. If you can close your eyes and think deeply. Okay, now open your eyes, and you don't have to say anything out loud, but what I want you to do through that exercise is notice the hybrid intelligence in the room that the algorithm is unable to see, that you basically have been taught to repulse or separate, but also that is not something that's easily scanned or recognizable by the machines or by anybody that's around you. So how can you sort of cultivate this cultural complexity and really think deeply, how can I not separate all aspects of me, all the different things I'm really great at and I love, but instead of separating them, how can I rethink of my future and sort of a business model that encompasses all of them in a very orchestrated, synergetic way? And how can I work with these systems instead of flattening them, creating more complexity and more layering versus imitating and flattening and being in the same box as everybody else. So I leave you with this. What if profound intelligence isn't artificial but hybrid? The reconnection of knowledge system institution trained us to separate. And what if we just need method for recognizing it? So how can you recognize that through that particular method? And if you want to learn more, I leave you with this that you can take an image of, because we can talk then about, you can learn a bit deeper how can, this is not an invitation for you to learn the system, but how can you discover your own system by observing the method and styles that I'm sort of developing in order to recognize your particular complexity and build upon that on your own through your particular perspective and your entire archaeology as well. Thank you so much. I'm not sure if anybody has questions, but I know we have a panel at 4 with Samar and Kabalan that we're going to discuss the synergy between both of our talks about what hybrid intelligence is. But if anybody has any question that's separate, please go ahead.
It's more a comment than a question, because the images you created, beyond the fact that I find them incredibly beautiful, there is something that is fascinating for me about them, is that whenever I see a picture, there's nothing really familiar about it, yet I feel like I'm at home when I'm looking at them. And I'm trying to spot what are the elements in the visual that are making me feel this familiar, and I cannot find them. And it means that for me that the familiarity is so embedded in the creative process that I can feel it, but I cannot see it. And so what I'm feeling is an unexpected belonging. Whenever I see any portraits you are creating, I can see every identity by itself, but I can also see how you are how you are managing to show the universal and make it personal. And I think this is very powerful. So thank you.
Thank you. Thanks so much. I just want to wrap up by saying to that comment is, I was having this discussion the other day with my dad, who is a neurologist, and there was a reason why I'm interested in the brain neurology, and my mom being an artist, neuroaesthetic, hello, is I was talking about dreams, and I was telling him, what if dreams are fragments of our ancestors? Is that possible? Is that neurologically even a possibility? And he was saying to me, it's not fully, scientifically fleshed out, but because of epigenetics and all these different things in our lived experience, that is very much possible. So when you look into, an image or anything that you feel deeply resonates with you, or even an experience that's cultural that you haven't necessarily grown up with or has been part of you, there's something that in your, particular life, whether it's presence or maybe indirect, that have impacted you deeply, where you feel that resonance. And that's basically how I feel when I kind of encounter things that I deeply connect with personally. Thank you.